Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today we're going to continue to take a look at time period 4. And so with this half of time period 4, we're going to take a look at the economic and social developments happening within the United States. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and look at each region of the country and kind of see the major characteristics of their economy, what are the major developments happening, and what are the major social things happening within the North, South, and the West. So big overarching things you want to be able to do. You want to be able to compare the Antebellum North, South, and West to one another, similarities and differences. And then also, as always, you're looking for continuity and change during this time period and compared to the time period previously. So, first thing we're going to take a look at is the North. What you want to first understand about just the regions of the country at the time. The nation is starting to become much more sectionally divided during the antebellum period. And so we're leading up to the Civil War. So remember, just make a note to yourself that the North and the South are growing apart socially, economically, and politically. They're being divided up between slave states and free states. And really they're battling over these western territories that the United States is acquiring through various different means, from purchasing like the Louisiana Purchase to the Mexican-American War. So economically speaking, we're going to kind of start in the North. And the major thing that's happening in the North is that America's economy is changing. And this is really, I wouldn't say exclusively a northern phenomenon, but primarily a northern phenomenon. What's happening here is that the North is industrializing and they're urbanizing. And this is known as the market revolution. And so another term or another phrase you can use to describe it is the first wave of industrialization in America. And if you look from 1820 to 1860, agriculture in America kind of gets cut in half, meaning the percentage of people who are engaged in farming as their primary profession. And really what's taking up the slack is manufacturing, construction, trades, a lot of these other things that are going to kind of start to shift America more into a manufacturing society. And by the Gilded Age, we're really kind of developing our industrial capacity. So it starts here pre-Civil War and the market revolution. Now, there's really two major components of the market revolution that you have to be aware of. The first one is called the transportation revolution. So you have a massive change in the way that goods are shipped across the country. And although, yes, people are traveling a little bit more and using these methods like canals and railroads, you really want to look at this as a trading network, infrastructure network. So this is kind of like what Henry Clay kind of dreamed of when he had like the American system of creating infrastructure, except this is not done by the federal government. This is done by state governments, mostly with canals. So what you're looking at here is the Erie Canal, financed by the New York State government and DeWitt Clinton, which really helped New York to gain a lot of trade in the time period. And other states kind of followed to try and build their own canal systems. And then you have private companies building railroads across the country. Now, one thing, again, you want to note, almost if you look at this, there are some southern railroads, but overwhelmingly, most of the railroads are located in the north, and this connects the northeast to the northwest, which are starting to become linked economically and socially. And the south, although they do trade with the northeast and send their cotton up to the textile mills, they're not as linked in socially and economically to the other parts of the country. Now, the other factor of the market revolution is this idea of the factory system. So what takes place in this pre-Civil War era is that America is going to, and different parts of the United States are going to shift from using a system called the putting out system to the factory system. So the putting out system is where you would kind of send your materials, if you were a manufacturer, out to like local artisans who would kind of create the products and then send it back to you, instead of having them come to a central location with the factory. So they're going to develop this factory system. The father of the factory system is a guy named Samuel Slater. And then Lowell is the guy who really kind of like takes it to another level. And he creates these textile towns and these factories throughout New England. And so essentially what's happening here is you're bringing your workers, usually it was young women from the countryside or Irish immigrant women who are working in these factories. And essentially, you had machines now to produce these products, and you could mass produce at a higher level than you ever could before. So America's kind of engaging in the Industrial Revolution here. England had gone through it in the late 1700s, and they're still going through it in the early 1800s, we're kind of like following suit and becoming more of beginning to develop manufacturing in the society. Now, a couple that goes along with this is the growth of big cities in America. So if you look at this comparing cities in 1820 to cities in 1860, there's tremendous growth in the country. Now you want to look at two areas of the country. The area of the country that sees the biggest growth of cities is the Great Lakes region. So we're talking about cities like Detroit, Buffalo, Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland. Those see tremendous growth. And if you connect that back to our earlier map here with the canals and the railroads, that's where the canals and the railroads are kind of connecting to, northeast to northwest. The other cities that see huge growth but not as much growth are going to be the northeastern seaboard cities like New York, Brooklyn, Boston, Philadelphia. They also see tremendous growth. So Americans changing as far as economically developing industrial capacity, but they're also kind of changing where they live. A lot more Americans are moving into cities during the time period. So that's a major change as well. Now, that's kind of like the economic picture. Now, what's going on socially within the North is a lot of different movements, actually. So you're seeing massive reform movements kind of take shape within mostly northern areas. And so like one of the biggest reform movements is a religious movement taking place called the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening is your second wave of evangelical Christianity coming to the United States. And this one kind of sweeps across really kind of like that Great Lakes region again. So they refer to that region like western upstate New York, western Pennsylvania as the burned over district. And essentially what's happening here is you have these very charismatic preachers like Charles Finney who are going out and holding these outdoor revival meetings, which you see a painting of here, to try and preach this new I guess, more emotional version of Christianity to the American people. And they're becoming widely kind of popular. And what you see as a result from these different preachings, you see a lot of branch-off divisions of Christianity. So you see like people like the Mormons are going to develop in this time period. You see this idea of Christian socialism. The utopian societies develop where they're trying to like branch off and like form like a perfect society out in their own little communities out there in the midwestern part of the United States. And what you see here is a tremendous growth of denominations happening from the Second Great Awakening. And so like this is really Protestant Christianity dividing up into further denominations. And this wave kind of sweeps across the nation. So it's important in its own right for like the religious movement that's taking place and the popularity of it. But it's also very important for its influence on reforms in other parts of American society. So you're also going to see this influence major reform movements in American society at the time. So these are some of the key movements that kind of stem. Some of them stem from the Second Great Awakening. Some of them stem from one another. So you see the temperance movement, the women's rights movement, education reform movement, abolition movement. So with the temperance movement definitely gets its origins in a lot of ways through the Second Great Awakening. And you have organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Society that are trying to convince Americans to limit their alcohol consumption because they feel like it's an ill of society. And so like these movements are very religiously inspired. Unlike some of these movements we've learned about recently, like the progressive era is coming more from a secular influence. This is coming more from a religious background because they think it's immoral, some of these things that are happening in American society. And so you see this famous poster, like I think it's the 7 steps or the 9 steps to being a drunk. And so like these were kind of popular to try and convince people to limit their alcohol consumption. Now, the principal reform movement of the antebellum period is the abolition movement. And so the abolition movement starts to take hold in different parts of northern society. And there's going to be all different types of abolitionists. Everybody from people of the members of the Back to Africa Society to the Free Soil Party. There's all these different types of abolitionists. So you want to know that the abolition movement to get rid of slavery within the United States, there's varying different reasons for why people want to be a part of this. A major difference is people who want gradual emancipation, like happened in the northern states after the American Revolution, and those who want immediate emancipation. So like some of your famous immediate emancipationists are William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, some of these leaders, and they both have newspapers. So William Lloyd Garrison has a newspaper called The Liberator. Frederick Douglass has a newspaper called The North Star. And so like you have people who are advocating for immediate emancipation and those advocating for gradual emancipation. Now, you also have a movement known as the Free Soil Movement that's happening in American Society for Abolition. And these are people who advocate for leaving slavery where it exists in America, but abolishing slavery in our newer Western territories that we're acquiring. And so you see this in like proposed amendments like the Talmadge Amendment and the Wilmot Proviso during the Mexican-American War, people who are advocating for not extending slavery because they see it primarily as a political issue. So you have some people who see it as a political issue, who don't want to divide the country up politically. You see some people who see it as a moral issue like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. And so they come in various different viewpoints on the reasons for abolition of slavery. Now, the other pretty significant reform movement of the time period is the women's rights movement. So the women's rights movement stems out of the abolition movement. A lot of your early women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretta Mott, these people are active also in the abolition movement, and that kind of spurs them to want their own equality as women, a form of gender equality. Now, the culminating event of the women's rights movement during the period is a convention that they hold called the Seneca Falls Convention. And at that convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton gives a famous speech called the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Sentiments, where she lays out basically the major goals of the women's rights movement and why they deserve to have political equality, which is what they want to push for. They lay out the ideas to get the right to vote. They want suffrage for women, and that becomes the major goal of the women's rights movement, which is not really achieved until much later during the end of the progressive era. All right, the last big social thing that we're going to take a look at with the North is that you have large-scale immigration happening to mostly the northern part of the United States. And so you have the two principal groups that are coming to the U.S. are the Irish and the Germans. And so first characteristics that kind of make specifically the Irish stand out and that Americans kind of see as different about the Irish as compared to previous immigrant groups is that the Irish are overwhelmingly Catholic. So America at the time is primarily a Protestant nation. The Irish are Catholics, and that kind of makes them like an outlier in a lot of ways. So the Irish are kind of working in industrial jobs. So what makes them a little bit different than your earlier immigrants, they're largely urban immigrants, and they're working in a lot of industrial jobs. They're helping to build the canals. They're working in the Lowell factory system. And so they're kind of engaging in, more industrial labor than previous groups of Americans. Previous groups of Americans, a lot of them settled on farmland. Now, that's true of the Germans a little bit more than the Irish. The Germans are going to kind of go more to the Midwest and kind of like have a little bit more money to set up their farms. The Irish are escaping the Irish potato famine. And so therefore, they're really kind of much more on kind of like manual labor side of employment. Now, in response largely to this influx of immigrants that are coming in, you're going to see a movement of nativism come into American society. So these are people who advocate for really kind of excluding these foreigners from the country, and they really, are an anti-immigrant movement within the United States. And so you see this in the Antebellum period. You see this later during the 1920s, the Progressive era. Also, you see kind of a nativist movement in response to the new immigrants. And so, like, during this time period, they actually formed their own political party called the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party tries to get people elected to specifically cater to one specific cause, which is the anti-immigrant cause. Okay, so we're going to kind of wrap our screencast there. We will have a second part to this comparative look at the different regions. So we will be looking at the antebellum South and westward expansion in our second half of this lesson.